I'm very happy to be able to connect with you all today. I was super interested in the presentation that just have been presented, because it has a huge link, which also talks about dark patterns, trying to basically define a bit more what is dark patterns within video games. So for those who are not acquainted with the term dark patterns, it was first used by Harry Brignall in 2010, defining it as tricks used in website and apps, such as a video game, that makes you do things that you didn't meant to. And so over the years, we have seen a widespread of different types of dark patterns in the digital landscapes and in social media, like for example with infinite scroll, into online marketplace, or the website with visual prominence, when you like that tricks you into accepting, for example, cookies that will track your behaviors over different websites. In video sharing platforms, for example, with the features of the autoplay, which basically will play automatically the video to like foster you to watch more and more and create addictive behaviors of watching videos, but also in video games. And there have been a lot of discussions regarding, for example, the gamification of a certain element in video games, notably via the use of loot boxes. So with the rise of attention around dark patterns, different academics tried to create a taxonomy, as Anthony also explained just before, and that led to some point at having different type of definition. And there have been a paper written by Mathieu Elhal in 2021 that try to identify what was the different facets of the dark patterns definition, both in academic paper and also some pieces of regulation that was available at that time. And so amongst those four facets, we have the characteristic of the user interface. So most of the definition really focused on user interface, using different type of adjectives such as deceptive, malicious, misleading, or other terms. You also have an effect on the user, which are either manipulated, deceived, exploited, or subverted in their own autonomy to make informed and autonomous choices and decisions. And then you had two other elements, which was like the role of the designer and whether the designer had the intention to actually cause a negative experience for the player, but also whether it would gain some benefit from using dark patterns, for example, to obtain consent regarding certain things, or to get users' data. And so with the substantiation of the concept of dark patterns being advanced, we saw regulatory initiative that try to tackle the issue. In general terms, you already had some legal provision that could indirectly apply to dark patterns. I, for example, think about the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive, which regulates commercial practice directed to consumer, and that could eventually apply to games. Also, the General Data Protection Regulation when it comes to processing of personal data. So in the European context. And in the US context, you also have, for example, the Federal Trade Commission Act that also protects consumer from unfair commercial practice. But those were not directly focusing on dark patterns per se, but rather to unfair commercial practice in general. And so in the provision highlighted in yellow, those are actually specifically prohibiting dark patterns, and they are quite recent. But the problem is that the scope is actually limited in different aspects, either from the material scope that they apply to, they only apply to specific situation, or to specific actors regarding their personal scopes, or to specific territory, especially, for example, in the US, you have a different regulation, but they are at the state level, and so would only be applicable for the specific state. And so this fragmentation also leads to a lack of uniform definition of what is dark pattern. And so when we are looking and we compare the different legal provision defining the patterns, we see that regarding the characteristics of the user interface, there are some differences. Certain legislation talks about practices, other about design techniques or subliminal techniques. And then you have also a difference regarding the need for proving the intention of the designer or not. For example, the DSA in Europe and the Detour Act in the US also provides that it's either on purpose, but also in effect. So even if the designer doesn't intend to manipulate users, if the design actually manipulates users into being impaired in their own autonomy, there might be a dark pattern. And finally, we can also see that only the Detour Act actually mentioned the benefit to the game company or the service provider in general, referring to obtaining consent or user data. So we see a lack of uniform definition. Now, when we talk about dark patterns in video games, there have been two major previous work. The first one is a definition of the term dark game design patterns by Zagal et al. It dates from 2013. And basically define the term as patterns that are used intentionally. So we find this intention in the game creator to cause negative experience for players, which are against their best interest and likely to happen without their consent. So we see both the element of game designer intention and a negative experience, which is quite broad as a harm for the player. And Zagal et al. Also develops the concept into different categories, which are temporal, monetary, and social. And Antonius already referred a bit to those different ones. So either manipulating the player to spending more time in the game or more money, or using the social capital of the player to invite more players to engage in the game and repeat the potential manipulation, also accumulating different patterns together. Then we have another definition that has been proposed on a website, which is darkpattern.game, which rather talks about gaming dark patterns, which are defined as something, so very broad, that is deliberately added. So we also have an element of intention to a game to cause unwanted negative experience for the player. So again, a harm on the player that is very broad, with the positive outcome for the game developer. So here as well, we mentioned the benefit for the game company. And besides identifying other potential patterns that could could be covered by the already existing categories that have been identified by Zagal et al. It also proposed a fourth one, which is a psychological category, which really focus on how a pattern could use different cognitive bias to really orientate the player toward engaging more with the game. So what did I try to do with the paper I submitted? Basically, I was trying to push a bit further the definition of dark pattern in video games by doing different things. First, analyzing the different definition of dark patterns that are currently available in both European and US legal frameworks. Analyzing and criticizing a previous proposed definition of dark pattern in video games, so the Zagal et al. One and the dark patterns.game. Introducing and defining a new terms, I refer to game dark pattern. Introducing three new categories to the existing categories of patterns, which are basically contractual, privacy, and behavioral that I will explain later. Providing a non-exhaustive overview of identified patterns. I do that I summarize that into a table that I will show later as well. Providing an overview of the EU legislation, you already saw it. It was this broad table with the different provision that may be applicable to the different dark patterns, and finally linking the different game dark patterns identified to the legal requirement they may breach. But why actually proposing a new definition? So as I said, the scope limitation of the different provision right now and the definition they provide creates fragmentation in the enforcement. Because if the authority that is competent to actually apply those provisions, it will be different authorities depending on the sector where the provision applies, as well as the territory. And so if they have different interpretation of what is a dark pattern or not, that leads to further fragmentation, which can jeopardize the prohibition of dark pattern, especially in video games. So one way to solve this would be through self-regulation, for example, via a code of conduct, which is also what we try to achieve in relation to this conference. And I think it is therefore very important to establish what we consider as dark patterns in video games by providing a definition and having a convenient term to refer to it. And so I will quickly highlight what I consider as potential issues with the previous definition, and go over the definition of the proposed dark pattern term. So regarding the limitation of the scopes, I will just briefly highlight them. So regarding the acts that are currently adopted, not yet effective, but adopted, we have the Digital Service Act in the EU, but it would only apply to video games that can be considered as online platforms. There is a specific definition of what is online platforms. I won't have the time to go dig deeper in this. But actually looking at that, we can already see that only very few video games would meet this first requirement. And then we have two other requirements, is that the game would be provided to professional players, because otherwise, if it's a non-professional players, we fall under the scope of the UCPD, the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive, and that the game doesn't collect personal data of the players. Otherwise, we fall into the scope of the GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation, when each time personal data of someone is collected, it would apply. And there is a specific provision in the DSA that says that if those two provisions, the UCPD and the GDPR apply, the DSA won't apply. So actually the material scope is quite limited. So it will almost never apply. We have another piece of legislation, which is the Data Act, which would only apply to actually games which has placed with IoT device, in the very specific situation of where the player would ask the game company to transfer the data that have been generated by the IoT device to a third party. And if the third party use a dark pattern to actually make the player request the data transfer, the prohibition would apply. So again, very, very specific situation, and which is unlikely to occur. And then we have this different state regulation, which basically prohibits the use of dark pattern to obtain consent of residents from the different states to agree to consent to a processing of their personal information. So it's only restricted to privacy or patterns that gain consent for processing their personal data in the specific states. So both a material limitation and a territorial one. And then among the proposed provision, we have the AI Act, which would only apply to video games which integrate AI system. So against not all game would be covered. We have the US American Data Privacy and Protection Act, which is a bit in the same objective than the state one, is prohibiting the use of dark patterns for obtaining consent to personal information, but it's still under discussion. And then we have the Doctoral Act, which is a bit broader, that would apply to any type of use of dark patterns, not only to the processing of personal information, but also consent to, I don't know, for example, a microtransaction. But the personal scope of this act is quite limited because it would only apply to online games with actually 100 million authenticated users in a month period. So it's only aiming at very quite large game providers, so that would also be insufficient. So we see that if we just rely on the existing law, there are very few instances when we can actually use those legislation to say that there is a prohibition of using dark patterns, unless we rely to other more general provision. So if we want to build a definition for self-regulation via a code of conduct, we could eventually use the existing definition, but there is something that, in my opinion, is a bit problematic, is that under those two definitions, there is a need to prove that a player suffer an actual harm from the game design, which is sometimes complicated because the harm can be distilled over time or be intangible. It's very hard sometimes to just prove a psychological harm. So it's very hard to prove. You also need to prove the designer intention, which again, how you prove that the designer was really intended for players to suffer that harm, not easy. And then you also, in the case of the gaming dark pattern definition, need to prove a positive outcome, and maybe that is more easy to demonstrate, for example, with economic profits, etc. But it's still is quite a burden in terms of proof. So what I suggest is to rather rely on a broader definition, which actually builds upon the existing definition of dark patterns that we find in the legal frameworks, and which basically will be any type of practice, so not only user interface, which are what the user see and interact with, but also the algorithm that are going in back end and actually create and have a huge impact on what the player will experience. Also the legal document that can be presented to the players when there could be unfair terms hidden in the contract and that nobody will read but still agree because they want to play the game, and any other type of commercial practice, which could be personalized marketing, for example, based on the data that have been collected from the player through the game. So any practice in relation to a video game, which either on purpose or in effect, so we not only rely on the intention of the game designer, but also could just demonstrate that the practice could have an effect of materially distort, subvert, or impair the ability of the player to make autonomous choice and autonomous and informed choice and decision. So there is both, on one hand, no autonomy, but also information that needs to be provided to the player, or is likely to do so. So again, not necessarily leading to a distortion of the autonomy of the player, but simply the simple potential would suffice. So that would alleviate a lot of the burden for actually establishing that a game pattern is established. And so how is this definition aligned with the existing legislation? So I refer to any practice which is closer to the UCPD, which is the broad provision regarding consumer protection in Europe. And I also explained why user interface might not be enough, because there are other elements that could manipulate players. The purpose or effect is also used both in the DSA and the Detour Act. I chose the wording materially distort, subvert, and impair, because that was the wording that was the most used in the different legal definition. And finally, I both refer to making autonomous choice and informed choice to include the informed choice, which is also something that that have been highlighted in the DSA. And that's referred to the information duties that a game providers should provide to the player. So on the basis of this definition, I also like identified 3 additional categories of patents. So contractual, which is when the pattern is associated with contractual agreements, such as terms and conditions. Privacy, which would intrude the player privacy to trick the player into obtaining more data or refraining him to choose more privacy protective settings. But also behavioral, that would leverage the analysis of the player's behavioral data in a way that enables further manipulation. So here is an overview of the different identified patterns. So I review some of the literature identifying dark patterns in general and trying to make them fit into the different categories. And then I linked all the different patterns, providing a description as well as the sources where they were identified to the actual relevant legislation, both in EU and US, and also sometimes providing some reference to cases where it have been acknowledged that they were infringing those provisions. So just as a conclusion, I would like to highlight the reviewer's comment on the submitted paper. So the one of the major comment was that there was a lack of methodology section, which is something I should further explain. And I definitely make a lot of effort to make more clarity on how I selected the different patterns and how I make them, I link them to the different legal provision. There were also some criticism regarding the fact that the proposition may be too broad in covering games that might be legitimate if they are adequately disclosed to players and they do not economically exploit them. For example, making the game harder to play, that would eventually undermine user autonomy without necessarily being referred as a dark pattern. So there is also a need to further define what is the player autonomy actually and how it could be affected by dark patterns in games, as well as further discussing potential overlaps between the category where one dark pattern would actually be covered by different categories of patterns. And finally, having more engagement with game-specific patterns, as most of the listed patterns in the paper were not necessarily game specific. So I hope I did not extend my time of talk. And so if you have questions, you can just scan these QR codes. We will have my email address, and in case I cannot reply to your question in the chat, you can always reach out to me if you are interested. Thank you very much.